She's currently working for New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, I think is the right word, but she has an extensive political and cannabis knowledge, and it will be very interesting to have you on board when we're talking about the global developments for the future, where we are heading to. I would also like to introduce my other guests. You just heard Zoe talking about New Zealand, and I'm very glad to have you here, Sabrina, from Fluence, and we can also, I think, talk about nearly every country. I think you have such a large experience in what's happening in the world of cannabis production and regulation. So this panel should be the international view on how politics and regulations deal with cannabis in this world. And afterwards, we are moving more to what is Germany doing. And we will have our, hopefully, you never know with politicians, our drug policy spokespersons from the German parliament here. And we will have a long discussion about what's coming up next. But before we start, I would love to have from each of you the idea of the State of the Union. Where are we globally with cannabis today? What is the overall perception in this world when we're coming to cannabis? Because so much happened over the last couple of years. Maybe, Sabrina, I start with you because you have such a unique view, especially with Fluence, who are providing lighting systems for cannabis production. So how do you see the development over the last couple of years?
Well, we see actually a great change. There was a lot of excitement when it started with Canada and the US, but now we see more realistic view on how to start, that people are thinking more on how to get a good project going, following the regulations of the country that they are in or that they are going to create the project. So in that sense, it is much more interesting to discuss projects nowadays on what we know, what we think works well in each region, instead of just speaking about the expectations and things that are like 5 years ahead of its time. So nowadays it's definitely more and more toned down and realistic, which is nice.
If you say it's coming down to a more realistic situation, is this hype, this gold digger mentality over globally?
I think that with every country that starts with the legalization of cannabis and that opens the market to producing cannabis, you get the excitement, obviously, of getting new projects going. You get all the excitement of the investors and whatnot. But what we also see is that while in beginning everybody was thinking now is the big, let's make it, is going to work always, bigger the better. Now we see more toned down projects where you start step by step, trying to follow the rules. People already start understanding what the regulations even of GACP, GMP actually mean. How hard it is to keep everything in standard, evidence-based, tracked, and so on. So now they know that actually this is a serious business on the scale and on the demand of the legal procedures or everything that you need to track. That everything's like, okay, let's start with a smaller, more toned down, and then expand from there. And in Europe, we tend to be a little bit more like, okay, step by step. Depending on the regions, in other areas you go bigger, and still is quite impressive to see sometimes. But yeah, in Europe, nice and steady.
So I think you saw both of it. You know, you have this experience in New Zealand, but also in the US with Curaleaf. How do you see what happened over the last couple of years when we see how different each market develops?
Yeah, so I've found that each market develops pretty much exactly the same, but what happens and what is different is the speed in which it does develop. So where in the US it was the early days and you'd see a lot longer for the stigma to be broken down, a lot longer for people to stop focusing on THC, THC, THC and actually understand different products, different minor cannabinoids and the terpenes and how they all work together. Because we have those states and early countries like Germany as an example, and the information is out there at patients' fingertips and doctors' fingertips, we see it moving a lot faster. Now, different regulations in different countries and different places, they do have differences within their regulations which affects how the markets develop. But you do see this much faster change happening now that we can actually look over the shoulder and say, hey, what have you done over here? What have you done over here? And how do we make something slightly better? And as well, we're getting the regulations and we're not starting off very open like they have in Canada, Colorado, California. They're starting more closed and then saying, okay, this works for us, but let's change a little bit here, let's change a little bit here, and slowly opening up. So you're seeing a much more sturdy regulation and framework for the industry to then grow upon.
So following up on that, so would that mean that in this case, being the first mover wasn't really helpful? If we look at what happened in Canada with the big bubble which bursted, and so did the industry learn?
I hope the industry learnt, but I think what you've got as well is most regulators and most governments are very conservative, and even the liberal ones, when it comes to different drug policies, they like to start off more conservative. And so what we've been seeing is these more slowly to open up regulations, what's working over here. But for instance, in New Zealand, Australia started off with a very stringent, very hard for patients to access. And New Zealand were able to see, hey, that doesn't work. And so we started with a much more open, but it was open enough that it wasn't, that it was controllable and it fit within our regulations. So you are that then puts a lot more parameters around for companies and industry to then grow and sit within there. But you still always do get the green rush, the people who come and they raise and spend $100 million and they don't know how to build the facilities, they don't know anything about the industry, they just want to they think they're just going to make money no matter how they grow, and they don't understand what this is about and what this industry is.
Talking about conservative governments, the perfect timing to move over to you. Frederike, you have been very active in politics and cannabis politics over the last couple of years. You were part of the discussion here in Germany on the cannabis liberalization. If we see globally a move to a more conservative side, what is your feeling? How will that impact the global developments on cannabis regulations?
Right. Well, thank you first of all for letting me join, and what a beautiful group of girls up here. So I'm very fortunate to be a part of that. Conservatism, huh? I think working in cannabis is one of these industries that takes a lot out of you as somebody who works in it. And the more you put in, the more you usually would see a correlation between input and reward. And I think that is different. And sometimes the hill that you climb, working on regulation and working on policies, feels inevitably steep. And like you can make a step forward, and then all of a sudden you make a giant leap, right? And usually that has something to do with the parties in power, but also the composure of the industry, I would say. These are very much interlinked. And if we're looking at a political and maybe regulatory shift towards conservatism, we can't let the people and the consumers out of it, because while governments become more conservative, overall, the world becomes more progressive, right? We see a lot of people switching their FMCG, fast-moving consumer good preferences, from alcohol to softer things, to mushrooms, to cannabis. to alcohol-free drinks. And I think that we are at a very interesting point in time where conservative governments are confronted with the reality of a people that ask for things that doesn't necessarily overlap. At the same time, it is also a beautiful thing for industry to work with conservative governments, because one thing that they are is predictable, right? Surprises aren't huge. They may not be pleasurable, but they certainly are not unforeseeable. So depending how you look at the market and what kind of market you want to be in and how you want to develop this market, is it a FMCG risk-related consumer goods market? Is it a more medical market? I think it is a very generous environment for companies to profile themselves in, to actually tug the same string. Because at the end of the day, yes, the conservative may not be open to legalization the way we know it from legacy and the demands that come with it from consumers, but they are open to cutting public spending, which means reducing external costs that are caused by highly risk-related consumer goods, which means they are very into fighting crime, right, and cutting down on illicit market activity. And I think coming back to the picture from the beginning of the very steep hill, that right now we're at the bottom of it, and I'm going to call it the conservative government hill for the sake of it, and it's going to feel very sticky for a while, like the climbing up and educating and continuing to educate and giving the same spiel that you have done 1,000 times. But once we as an industry find a common stance that resonates with the narrative of a conservative government, I do believe that there will be giant leaps forward if you are willing to compromise with the interests of a conservative government. And speaking to Zoe's point of companies maturing and kind of learning on not to repeat growing pains in other markets slowly but surely, I think this is something that is very, very well manageable if you are in a position to kind of hold your horses and are in it for the long game.
Yes.
You mentioned two things which I would like to continue discussing. The one thing is conservatives love to fight crime, and the other one is a stigma. And I think both things we see in the conservative government area. First question from that perspective is, after now a couple of years of medical cannabis out, having more and more liberal approaches on cannabis, if it's the US, if it's Canada, if it's part of Australia's approach, if we see what's happening in Germany, why is there still this huge element, especially in conservative governments, of cannabis is an entry-level drug? If the kids use cannabis, they will end up the next step with heroin, and we have to regulate that they don't have access, that nobody has access. Why can't we change that? What is needed? Zoe?
Data is needed, and clinical trials are needed. I think we're very lucky that it is starting to grow. We are getting more data. We are having more clinical trials. The issue is that they're not getting that penetration into the medical community. They're still not teaching it at medical school. And the doctors that we do have, I can't speak for the ones in Germany, but from the ones in New Zealand, they are overworked and they do not have any spare time to go out there and actually learn and understand. And so then it is up to the educators to go out there and start saying and compiling, and that's what we do, is we compile all the clinical trials, and some are positive, some are negative on cannabis, but it is the data and there is the link, so it is easy for the doctors in the medical community to take. But my opinion on the conservative side is that they are, now that we have medical, they are understanding that this isn't big and scary, and that everyone's not going to run off and be doing hard drugs in 5 minutes if they have cannabis. So the medical is really starting to destigmatise it, but it does take time. It takes time for the mother of a politician to start using it for their arthritis and to see the benefits, or the child or niece or nephew of one of them, and that personal connection for them to actually understand how powerful this medicine is compared to other pharmaceuticals and what it can do and how it can help us. And then we'll start to see the change, I think.
Sabrina, coming once again back to stigma.
Yep.
What do you think, how much impact that still has on how these markets we are currently seeing and new markets coming up will develop? Is there an element of it will be easier in the next couple of while because we saw that markets or countries with a more liberal system didn't collapse? Or is that still something what you just said is an uphill battle with data and...
I work with growers. So I am part of the production side. Having lights in the production side, what we see is often the concern that it needs to be standard, right? We are talking about productions that governments and all the institutions are taking a look at and consistently checking if they are in the specs. I'm Portuguese. Portugal has been doing this for the past 5 years, more or less. And what I've seen and what I consistently see in every country that starts is that the moment that you have institutions following it, checking data, the companies are on track. They are doing their best to keep on track. The stigma starts to become lower. And what we see in other countries is that while the governments and the policies are still thinking how to do it, more and more I feel that the population around these countries are more open to it, because countries like Portugal, countries like Germany are doing the effort of making rules and regulations and giving it a try of it needs to function in some way, right? Portugal and Germany are completely different in the way that they chose to go, but nevertheless, you see that because people are more and more confronted with the fact that there are companies that are following regulations and getting good products out, evidence-based, with data supporting why they are doing it, clean and whatnot, more and more people are trusting that this is actually functioning and is more safe and secure to access. So for me, I started in this business of helping growers in cannabis 6 years ago, and everybody would look at me weird. I was like, why? Why? And nowadays the reaction is totally opposite. Totally opposite. And I find that it is quite an exciting moment to see the evolution, and I think that many countries are having the pressure of they cannot lag behind. They cannot. They are slowing it down. They are too slow to decide, but the pressure is starting to become bigger and bigger on we need some rule, we need some way of working in this country, in that particular country, in some way to allow this industry to be regulated and give us the products that we need. More people think like that nowadays.
I like that comment about you starting 6 years ago. I have a very similar story. A very good friend of mine is a journalist of a very large German newspaper with 4 letters, so every German knows what I'm talking about. And at that time he asked me how I want to explain that to my children one day, that I'm working for cannabis. And I asked him, okay, how do you explain your children you're working for that newspaper? But nevertheless, it is, I think the point you are making is, do we need to be even more transparent? Because my experience was the moment I bring a politician into a facility and show what we are doing and how we are doing things, that changes perspective completely.
Yes, actually, one of the things that was wonderful of working in the Netherlands is that in the Netherlands, for any other horticulture system, companies are always working together, creating systems on how to make it flourish and function all together. That brings a lot more trust, because you are more open, you share information, you grow faster on that information because you're getting into the nit and gritty of what functions, what is overrated, how to do it. Is this way better or that procedure better? How do you do it? How do I do it? How do we got around this new regulation that is coming in? How did it function for you? It goes faster. When I started 6 years ago doing research in cannabis growing under LEDs, we were bringing data, and the fact that we were sharing our results and inviting different growers to come in and see our demonstrations, how they function, bringing other companies to join. We had events where we would be LEDs, substrate, nutrients, all in all, and discussing openly what we know, what we don't know, surprised so many cannabis growers. And we were risking it at the time because we thought they don't want to share. They come from an industry that is very closed. But more and more, we see that the community needs more of this on a professional level. Because obviously the community is big and they share information. But one thing is sharing information of how I experienced it in my own growing way. And another one is sharing the experience of how did you build this data set? What are the values? Why did this happen? Do you know? And we track and trace things. Is a very different way of working, and is very exciting to see.
How much passion do the growers have? Isn't it just incredible to see, and how much passion everyone in this industry has for what we're doing?
Yeah.
And I think that that's such an incredible thing. And when you've got that, you get this environment where people do share and people do want to work together. So I think there are some bad actors in the industry and this and the other, but what I've found and what I tell people is they're like, oh, I'm new to the space, who do I trust? I said, whoever's open and wants to talk and passionate and loves what they're doing, they know their stuff, they know what they're doing, they're passionate, you want to hang with them. The ones who say, oh no, I'm not sharing that, you know that there's something a bit going on there that you don't really want to work with them.
Frederike, we just heard from Georg about how much passion was put in over years from the activist side. So we just said how much passion we have from the grower side. You as a policy expert on how we play with politics, how we explain things to politics, if not saying the bad word of being a lobbyist, how can we use that power, that passion we see across the board to even go further and convince politics that it's not just not bad, but there's a huge potential in it?
Right. First of all, I love that dirty word, and I love myself calling it, so I hope one day that there is a point where I will get back to it. Speaking to Zoe's point about passion and your point about stigma, I think what's there to understand about stigma is that basically the presence of stigma means the absence of trust with a very high level of fear. That's what that is. And that happens on both sides of the aisle, where for the first time in history are in a regulatory and legislative environment where some people know what they're doing, also from the regulator side. That experience was missing for a very, very long time against the legacy market, which had years, if not decades or centuries, to collect experience on what works, but was discriminated against, which is a very good reason to be very fearful. And if you put yourself in a legislator's shoes who has to go serve an electorate, a conservative one even, they also are scared to do wrong because policy impacts people's lives. And having been very, very close personally to that bubble and sharing part of that lifestyle, I assure you, and I know it's a hard ask, especially in this room, to have compassion for policymakers. Nobody does policy because they want an easy life, because they want to earn super good money, and because they just want to...
And you can only do wrong.
Right.
They can
where
never
you can
keep
never
everyone
win,
happy.
right? So what happens, you try to regulate a very difficult market because it's not a commoditized market, right? there are no product categories or anything, from both sides of the spectrum with a lot of fear. So how do we build a bridge in that? To Zoe's point, I think the data is right. And to kind of get the data across, Dirk, which I know is a point that a lot of lobbyists struggle with, unfortunately, I think there is a big, big element of compassion in it. Talking, understanding that things take time, understanding that the innovation cycles in the industry and the intent to make money and the intent to do good from an industry side don't match policy timelines, which in per definition are a lot slower. And then unfortunately, policy is done in very specific ways. And even with conservatives, who by definition don't like change, there is a need to cater to the formats that are accepted. That is an unholy truth, and that is one for this industry who is just allowed to bloom and be themselves for the first time open in public, asking themselves to put themselves in the what does a policymaker want to hear box to convey their innovation and their information. That is hard, but at the end of the day, making policy means playing by the policymaker's rules. And if that means making yourself palatable, finding out whom to talk to, in which ways, who will champion you, in which rooms you can speak openly, and in which rooms you can speak openly but have to make a hefty step forward and maybe sacrifice some of that passion in order to get ahead, is something that is hard to do, I realize, but something that is necessary in order to be heard. And Zoe, I was with a firm that did evidence-based policy making. We did a lot of tax regulation, which I loved. And even if the numbers are on your side, if somebody doesn't wanna, they don't wanna. You can force somebody through a wall, right? That's an impossible point.
That's why that personal connection is
there. You go.
Needed.
That is exactly it. And all you can do is like take a toothpick and start scraping at the wall and get piece by piece by piece out of it, and then you hit them hard and heavy, right? Once the time is right, and that level of personal experience of a mom having cancer needing to treat nausea, for example, comes in, and it helps. And it helps to sweeten the deal by being willing to be taxed.
Well, that's obviously something which is always interesting in a discussion. I would like to use that perspective we just heard, and we are all coming from markets where we have experience now with the next steps. But if we look across the globe, we have a lot of countries. Like France, where I would love to have some insights from a good friend of us later on. But also, if we go into the extremes, we have countries like Hungary, where there's not even a debate about cannabis. We have countries like Austria, where we have, which is weird, we have a government-led production for dronabinol, but we have no access scheme at all to cannabis. We have countries like Russia or China and so on. So how can we as an industry, as partners, move ahead and empower other countries to follow the lead? Or is it something we shouldn't even consider?
It is very much in consideration, actually. The experience I've been having in the last couple of years is actually going back to the policy, like you were saying, one step back. The policy helps actually a lot on creating at least some sort of guidelines of what we need to hit as a target. The moment that happens, companies that are normally producing solutions for this type of field know how to play with those particular rules. It makes the procedure of having access to products, even for the growers, much, much easier. So for us, Fluence is a global company. The moment that we know the rules of a country, we know how to help get access to the lights, if they can be sold in that particular location, and how, to what specs, because sometimes, for example, there's rules on how much energy you need to spend and whatnot. So it's very much more like, at least some guidelines. Are they perfect? No. Sometimes they are not perfect, but at least it gives you a room to work, which at that point also allow us to be ambassadors. We have governments visiting our demonstration locations. We have government asking us, you are a global company, how are you supporting growers in other countries? What are your bottlenecks? What would you do better? I have been having presentations showcasing how cannabis is grown, how the clients grow cannabis, what type of expectations in certain tropical countries or not, what do we know, where do we stand. So being able to talk with governments from Costa Rica, Argentina or Ukraine, we had the Ukrainian committee visiting last year. So suddenly it's like they know that we exist. We start getting more a trustworthy way of working, and they come to learn on how is it, where do you find the bottlenecks, so that they bring at least some of that information that hopefully help their policymakers also understand what they can improve or which style they should follow in their own country, because each country to its own. It's very interesting to see. Because 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I didn't have that experience, and now I have to present to them saying this is the data sets, these are experiences, these are bottlenecks. It helps a lot.
I think also you've got three groups when you talk about government and regulations that you need to work with. You've got the politicians, you've got the regulators, and then you've got the policymakers. And so sometimes they each have different perspectives on what it means and what they want and how they want to do it, and they can all be completely different. And so then it is, I think, around that education, around that data, around that transparency, and making sure that is open of what works and what doesn't. But there are three different groups that you do as lobbyists, or as what we do in trying to talk to the government about how it works. But then I think you've also got to make sure that the regulations are fit for purpose. So in New Zealand, you've got medical regulations. Are they fit for purpose for medical? They absolutely are. All regulations could be slightly better, but I think that they're fantastic. But then you've got people complaining about them, and it's because they're trying to get non-fit for purpose within those regulations. And it's not about, hey, we now need to make medical adult use and make it a free-for-all for everything, but it's about saying this is medical, now let's create the next regulations for the adult use or for the nutraceutical or for the pets and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and if I can add, maybe uniting both of your points, trust that they talk. Trust that the three that you name talk, and trust that the ones that you are talking to across countries talk as well. So every bit of quality information you place tends to travel one way or another. Hence, all the way more important for companies, especially the ones who have a genuine interest in building a sustainable market and giving back to the communities who did the hard activist work all these years to even have policymaker conversations to begin with, to put that content forward and to invest in advocacy and lobbying and supporting patient groups and supporting activist groups to achieve access to these rooms. And once they are in, pouring it into formats that translate. So everything in policy and policy making is about bargaining. So imagine yourself going into a conversation with a poker chip, right? You're putting your poker chip on the table. Think about, who is that poker chip going to be worth $1 more than to the person you presented it with?
So you just said, there are the three elements of we have to consider. I would like to move a bit to the medical cannabis world. And it's so interesting to see, because you're coming from New Zealand, you have a very strict market access regulation, so you have to go through a registration process where you have to prove. It's very similar or very comparable to what we see in Poland. We have markets like Germany where it is some kind of easier to get product into the market. And we have a country like the UK, for example, where we're dealing with some kind of not really regulated framework where we are missing that. Is there one of these elements or one of these structures, which one would you say is the best to start with for countries who are willing to move that way?
This is potentially
why?
This is potentially a very unpopular opinion, but I think that where you see countries like Canada or states like Colorado, California open everything up, and then they have these systems that aren't fit for purpose, that don't work, and then they try and close them, it is just a complete and utter disaster. Whereas what New Zealand's done is we did start very regulated, very strict, and then what's happened is the regulators have been absolutely fantastic. They talk to industry, to patients, to doctors, to prescribers, what's working and what isn't working. And so through that, they've been able to see, hey, we actually missed out on a bit of regulation which has stopped growers from using anything on their plants, so we're going to update the regulations. And also, we are exporters here in New Zealand, but our regulations don't allow for that really and truly, and so let's update that. And so then they're able to take this and update it and change it. But you have to be as well working with a regulator, or have a regulator and policy maker that wants to keep improving it and that does actually believe in the medical benefits of it. And I think in New Zealand we're so incredibly lucky to have regulators who believe that this is medical, that believe that this is medicine, and are trying to do what they can in order to get that access for patients. And that's what their goal is, and that aligns with ours and a lot of the other industries. So that's where we get a lot of that. They listen to what we have to say if there's something going wrong or if there's an issue. They don't just take it in isolation.
And I think you are also having one of the very few governments who see the potential in the industry, not in just having the process, but seeing there's a potential for an industry growth, because I think that's what a lot of us are lacking across the globe. For me personally, it's totally not understandable why a country like Canada, which is so progressive over the last couple of years, doesn't really support the industry to have impact globally. And I think the same applies to every European country nowadays. But I would also love to get an idea of, when we're looking globally, and that's kind of the theme we're trying to have with that summit every year, how can we align better? I'm always thinking about there in the alcohol industry, and I know it's an interesting stuff, but they were facing a lot of challenges in the past. Surprise, surprise. But they came up with, okay, it is a question of international politics, of international treaties, and they formed something which was called the World Spirit Alliance, where companies, trade associations, etc., aligned. I mean, we're a very young industry. We still have to say we are all knowing and trying to build associations, trying to build understanding about that. But maybe Sabrina, how, as Europeans, how can we start?
I think that in almost every country where there's some sort of regulation or trying some sort of regulation, the regulation comes as a regulating the production of it. And then you have two groups fighting. The one that wants to grow within those regulations, and then the recreational that comes into that world and fights against it, saying you are following regulations. Unfortunately, I think that for a large group of growers in this business, in the medical perspective, we need to understand and play by the game of the rules. Pharmaceutical components were always largely regulated. Understand how they think, understand how that system thinks, try to fit your products into how that system functions. And often what we get is producers that are fighting against it. You fight against it, you don't get your product in the medical market. The second step that we see that often we get a bottleneck is that I'm working with growers with a certain spec because they think that is what looks that gets a better spec for their flower quality. The doctors are not being informed of what that is, how that functions. And in the pharmaceutical, the majority of the doctors, they are overworked. They receive pharmaceutical assistance explaining what were the latest tests, how that medication worked. They look at the trials, they look at the data, they understand it, they suddenly understand at least the basics of it. They start getting acquainted with that information and they start prescribing that medication for a certain disease, for a certain situation. We don't see that connection happening in the cannabis industry yet. And when I ask the growers, when I ask what are the specs that we need to hit, why are we aiming at it, we can't explain it in a medical way. This is a bottleneck that I, for example, as helping growers have. I can hit a 20 THC, I know how to do a spectral recipe and so on and so on. But why are we aiming at that exactly? For the medical purpose is...
I think we'll all laugh here of like someone, the number of times that I've heard, I grow the best cannabis in the world, and you're like, well, how do you define that?
Exactly, for what exactly?
And I think you've hit on an amazing point, Dirk, and I think that we should come together afterwards and start putting together some international standards around this and create this, because it is needed, so why not, let's get on and do it. But it's what's happened, for going off topic here a little bit, but...
we have our small fire here. Don't worry.
It's something that's happened in New Zealand is everyone knows Manuka honey.
Mm-hmm.
What's ended up happening is the Manuka honey industry fragmented slightly, so now you've got two different standards of how to actually measure the quality of it and what's a high quality, which is so confusing to consumers. And so I think that there is a massive need for industries across the globe, or industry associations, for there to be one place where we come and we say, hey, this is how we benchmark. We pick a couple of things, whatever they are, terpenes, cannabinoids, and we create some standards and some easy education for it to be given to doctors, to politicians, to regulators and policymakers, so that they are able to understand in that simple way.
I really love that discussion, because for me it's isn't cannabis something completely different to anything else we have seen in this world so far, because we have these two directions. We have the consumer direction and we have the medical direction, and we have some kind, and we have even much more if we think about industrial hemp, but that could fill another day. What I find interesting is that if we look across the globe, we have not found, or I haven't found one market where you have really a good distinction between what is medical, what does it mean, and what is recreational. If we look at Canada, where we have both markets, it's not really well defined. If we look at Germany, we're having the discussion if the recreational market is slipping into the medical market. But I see your passion in your eyes and that you want to talk about that.
Well, Dirk, if I may, I think that largely depends on product categories and how you look at the market. What is the main product in the market? It is a flower, right? And the same flower that benefits a patient will also be enjoyed by somebody having a good time as a consumer. And when we look at other commodity markets or pharmaceutical markets, there are very steep distinctions. Mm-hmm. So I see the effect that you're describing, and I think it is something that pains the industry at this side, especially on the regulatory front, because it doesn't depict like the multifaceted reality of the industry and the product categories. At the same time, I think this is something that has largely to do with innovation and how we look at that and how governments decide to move that forward. Who knows if this will be a discussion in 5 years' time, because flower is still the primary medicinal product in a market? What if it becomes capsules? What if it becomes medical edibles? What if it becomes more vapes and becomes more standardized? The more standardized something is, the easier it is to regulate. That's very simple.
If I may add on that, actually,
Sure.
Portugal only has medical.
That's true.
There's a very straight way of doing it, in a way, simplifying. Medical is only in pharmacies. You need a prescription, you get it in a pharmacy, you get it in a specific way with a specific inhaler. All of that is defined by Infarmed. And all of that is what is classified as medical. Outside of those specs is not medical, is recreational. And recreational is not open in Portugal. So in that aspect is very clear line, despite the struggles of people accessing it, because it's not easy to access it in Portugal at all, by all means. But there's a very clear classification of how is a cannabis flower medical in Portugal. That's a very clear definition. In many other countries, I think we are paying the price that we are mixing, indeed, that you have patients that start learning how to take and use cannabis for their needs, but they can only access via what we would classify recreational channels. It took forever in companies like Fluence to understand the market sizes and what is for patients and what is actually for fun and so on. One thing is indeed having it for fun in a recreational way. Another thing is patients needing to access it via the recreational because they have no other way of accessing it. And that's a very different situation. I think that more countries, the moment that they would do more regulations to access this way, we would see more people going and getting flowers or getting extracts or getting what is in the pharmaceutical level. Because for me, I've personal experience now. 6 years ago, if I would want to get flowers for any medicinal way, I would not have no way how to understand it in the recreational world. But if I go to a pharmacy, I trust that what the doctor gave me is what I need, right? This is the step that is hopefully developing for the future few years.
I like that view, but on the other hand, and I would go back to Zoe on that, if we look at our growers, and you had that in the past, earlier today, they are coming with such a passion, but usually coming from a non-medical perspective.
And a non-commercial perspective as
That's
well. And they need support and we need to harness their passion. But one of the points that I just want to touch on, and building from Sabrina's point, is over in the States when I was there, the common theme that I heard throughout from what at the time were now patients were that before regulations, they were considered that stoner. They'd go to their doctors and they would, hey, do you take any drugs that aren't prescribed to you? I smoke cannabis. Or don't, here's some pamphlets to quit. Post-regulations, what happened was that they then said, oh, why do you take it? And what then came out of that was that most of these people who had been self-managing their condition were then told, no, actually, I think you may have this condition, so I'm going to send you for some additional testing, or we're going to go down this pathway. And they were no longer self-medicating. They were then finding the proper dosage or the proper form for them to use in order for them to properly manage their condition. Yep. And so I think that there is no other product like this and that I know of. Like alcohol is purely seen as adult use. That cross over medicinal to this point, but not just medicinal, but nutraceutical, beauty, hemp, animal health, animal medicine. There is such a wide variety of applications that there does need to be some sort of understanding of what it can create and how it does work.
Oh, by all means. Germany, 6 years ago, having to follow all the rules to build a facility in this country.
I know what you're talking about.
we had to follow rules that we were is seriously it was
We
so
had to
hard.
grow in a bunker.
Yes, and
be
it
clear.
was so demanding, and
So-
I was. There's a moment that we start saying, companies like ours come also to discuss, like, let's bring some reality and reason to it, because this is a bit overboard, and we can help. And with growers, we also do that. It's like often they are getting into this business, and we can help them say, your targets, we can help you meet it. Because we have the data now, and we know, and we help. But when you start in certain regulations, it's very hard. Germany was so hard 6 years ago. I kid you not.
Yeah. You won't believe it. We are already talking for 50 minutes. But I love to end my panel discussions always with, next to the fireside, having the crystal ball. I always want to know a year ahead. Next year, Mary Jane, not 60,000 people having a good time, maybe 100,000. I don't know. We always ask, where will Germany stand? But I want to know from you and your opinion. I think the biggest challenge ahead of us is that we need to have a different approach internationally, because the biggest hurdle we still have, I think, is the UN Single Narcotic Convention, which stops us from doing a lot of stuff. Or you have to be pretty brave to go ahead. If we look a year ahead or more, what will it take us to really go and have a first approach on changing the UN Narcotic Convention? Let's start with the policy women.
Oh, wait, thank you. Sabrina, I just want to echo real quick before I get into it your last point, which also lends itself to the point moving forward. That was 6 years ago. And while, working in cannabis takes a lot out of you, look at it now. Look how far we have come. I mean,
It's quite incredible.
the people on the
Yes.
stage every minute suffered through it and paid with probably 10 years taken off their life.
Blood, sweat, and tears.
There you go. But the progress is incredible. Nobody would have dreamt of this,
No.
good and bad and everything, in it 6 years ago.
Yes.
So currently I feel this industry is in one of these innovation cycles where it's almost unthinkable of what's to happen next year. And I think for the first time we're in a situation where ethical players interested in sustainable growth are well funded enough to think about the level you're talking about, because it used to be a distant dream of working with the UN, of going to COP conferences, of putting forward this sort of regulation. So I think it takes a couple of 2 or 3 or 4 brave players out of markets forming an alliance, putting bold ideas forward, going through the cycle of being hit with reality and shaving off bits and bits of that dream and coming to a realistic kind of picture that slowly but surely will convince the UN regulators. That being said, all under the assumption that not another crazy war is breaking out and cannabis is wiped off the international agenda altogether. And I think as final appeal, I think, Zoe, you're doing it with your business. You are to work a lot with partners. Look towards industries who have done it. Take counsel from industries who have mastered these systems, because it's difficult, but it's not undoable. And this outside expertise takes away a lot of the blood, sweat, and tears, and maybe, only leaves you with the tears, I would say.
So will we sit next year together in Vienna talking to the UN about that stuff? Or is the time not there yet?
I think we're there. I think that we're at a point where we're creating these global partnerships, these global bonds and this network to create and to build up this industry. So I think we're there. I think we need to just get on and do it. Dirk, I don't think we should be talking about it any longer. I think we just need to get up and go. And I think that what we're doing, and we've got to that pivotal point in our industry in New Zealand where we can create this partnership, this bond, and bring everyone together, that we just need to do that on a global stage, because that's what we're here for. Is we're all here for the patients. We're all here to help people. So why should we keep sitting on our bums and not actually get up there and make something happen? So we're gonna talk after this.
My flight is shorter than yours. Sabrina, what do you think?
6 years ago, a few companies were starting quite alone in this industry, and I say companies, big companies that never worked in cannabis but needed to provide services to cannabis were starting and daring. Last year and this year at GreenTech, being the horticulture business, horticulture is conventional, all other types of crops. We had events where 60 different companies came to see where they could be contributing, how does this work, coming in. The fact that the companies are no longer afraid of coming into this business and check how it is gonna help. And I think that if you pick, like she was saying, if you pick a few of the global players and get them sitting down next to doctors, next to the policymakers that have been handling this, we have quite a good chance of make a breakthrough in the next couple of years, because that is, we've been there. We've been there for the last 6 years. We have evidence enough, and the industries, the whole industry is warming up to us. Let's put it that way.
This is such an amazing comment, because I had the feeling on Thursday when I walked through the halls here, discovering that there are, let's say, company who always produced soils for gardening with very known brands. When you have your small garden, all of a sudden coming up with specialized soil for cannabis growing, and they have no problem with that. I can remember before we had the liberalization, we had discussions with supermarket brands and so on, who wanted to understand better what they will be able to sell. So I think that's a very good vision also to see when other companies who never dealt with cannabis come into that play. That's a very interesting sign. And I wanted to also to sum that up, because I like that story, that things have changed so dramatically. A couple of weeks ago, we as the association had our parliamentary evening, so where we invite politicians and talk about it, and we did that in the premises of the German Agriculture Association, so Farmers Association. And we had one politician there, and I don't say a name, but he sat there and said, you know, if I could imagine 3 or 4 years ago that I'm sitting in the Farmers Association building, having people around me smoking joints, listening to a musician who is doing cannabis-focused songs, and be surrounded by a professional industry, I would never ever dreamt of that. So, and I think that's a very good point to close that round, because I think I'm looking forward to invite you again next year, because I think that's a great round, and I would love to have 20 of you here on that stage, because I think if we connect internationally, we in 5-6 years a lot of stuff is possible. Thank you for contributing so much, and it was a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for having us.
Let's dream big.
Thank you, everyone.